All right, get ready, because today we're diving into one of Alaska's most haunting unsolved mysteries.
Oh, this is going to be good.
The Investor.
Yeah, the investor. A fishing boat that turned into, uh, well, a scene of just unimaginable horror
Back in 1982, September 6th to be exact.
in Craig, Alaska.
A small town, quiet, and then the Investor is found, engulfed in flames.
8 people gone, just like that.
Eight souls lost.
A whole family.
Mark and Irene Coulthurst, young couple expecting their third child.
And their 2 little ones. Kimberly, just 5 years old, and John, only 4.
And it wasn't just them. 4 young deckhands, just starting their adult lives, also lost.
Chris Hammond, Jerome Keown, Dean Moon, and Mike Stewart. All teenagers.
This wasn't just some accident.
No, this was murder. Alaska's worst unsolved mass murder, to be exact.
What gets me, it's not just the brutality of it all.
It's the precision, the almost unsettling level of control.
Yeah.
This wasn't some chaotic, heat of the moment thing. Everything points to the killer methodically moving the boat, taking steps to make evidence disappear.
Like they knew what they were doing.
Exactly. And get this, it seems the killer actually steered the investor after the murders, like it was just another day on the water.
Chilling, isn't it?
It really makes you question, like, what kind of person could do something so horrific and then just vanish? Poof, like a ghost.
Decades, this case has been baffling investigators.
And here's another layer. There was a suspect. Actually went to trial, but the case.
Still officially closed. Unsolved.
So are you ready to unpack this?
Yeah,
Try and make some sense of what happened that day.
absolutely.
I think to even begin to grasp it, we have to start with the human element. Those 8 lives. The Coulthursts, the deckhands, the families left behind.
It's so important to remember that even when we're talking forensics and timelines, we're talking about real people. 8 individuals with their hopes, their dreams, their loved ones, and the impact on that small town, Craig, Alaska. It's still felt today. The sources we have really drive home how remote this all was. The Investor, a 58-foot fishing vessel, found burning in this secluded bay. This wasn't a crime that happened under the city lights. This was the Alaskan wilderness. Vast, unforgiving.
Isolation like that, it adds a whole other layer of complexity to the investigation. 1982. Think about it. Forensic technology. Nowhere near what we have today. DNA analysis was just starting out. You've got a crime scene exposed to the elements, a remote location, limited resources.
So a burning boat, 8 victims, a killer who seemed to have planned everything out. What did the initial investigation find?
Well, they determined all 8 victims were shot, most likely with a .22 caliber pistol or maybe a rifle. The boat, the way it was moved, set on fire, it all pointed to a deliberate cover-up. There was even a suspect description, but vague. A white male, early 20s, pockmarked complexion. Talk about a needle in a haystack.
Trying to find someone fitting that in Alaska back then.
Almost impossible.
Did they ever get a lead?
2 years later, 1984, the investigation took a turn. Suspicion fell on John Peel, former deckhand. Worked with Mark Coulthurst. They thought they had their man, charged him with the crimes.
Did they have solid evidence? A motive?
Well, that's where it gets even more complicated. There were 2 trials. High profile, expensive, gripped the whole nation.
Yeah.
Peel was acquitted, both times.
Acquitted. But if they thought they had the right guy, how? Was the evidence just not strong enough?
It seems that way.
Yeah.
Despite the prosecution, it wasn't enough to convince the jury beyond a reasonable doubt. And with those acquittals, the investigation basically stalled. Dead end.
So Peel walks free, but with that cloud of suspicion hanging over him. What happened to him? And if not Peel, then who?
Well, imagine being accused of something so horrific, tried, and then acquitted. The toll it takes. Peel sued the state for wrongful prosecution. Ended up with a $900,000 settlement.
Wow.
He called it a tragedy that just got compounded and compounded.
That's heartbreaking. Legally cleared, but his life was forever changed. So where does that leave the investigation?
Officially. The Alaska State Troopers aren't actively looking for the investor killer anymore. They consider the case closed.
Closed. But it's not solved. We're back at square one.
Exactly. Horrific crime. A suspect tried and acquitted. And no clear answers. It haunts everyone. The investigators, the families, the whole community of Craig.
So let's recap. Remote crime scene, a family, and 4 young men murdered, a suspect who walked free, and a case that's closed but not solved. It's like a real-life whodunit with no ending. Where do we even go from here?
Before we jump into the evidence, the theories, all those unanswered questions, we need context. We need to understand Alaskan fishing in the 80s.
Right. The industry, the isolation, the harsh conditions, that's a whole different world. And maybe, just maybe, that world holds some clues to what happened on the Investor.
You're getting it. So let's explore that world and see what we can uncover.
Welcome back. Now, before we get into, well, everything else about the Investor case, we need to sort of set the stage. Alaskan fishing in the 1980s.
Yeah, paint that picture for us. It was a boom time for the industry. But let me tell you, it was a demanding, often dangerous life. Long hours, brutal weather, weeks, sometimes months, away from family.
Isolated.
Exactly. And that breeds these really tight-knit communities.
Mm.
But also intense rivalries.
Yeah.
Simmering conflicts.
So you're saying there was this Wild West element out there on the water, like disputes among fishermen weren't uncommon?
Oh, absolutely. Imagine you're out there in this remote, sometimes lawless environment, relying on each other, but also competing for the same resources.
Fish, territory, money.
Right. So disputes over territory, catches, even just perceived slights could escalate fast.
Almost like a pressure cooker. And with so much at stake, yeah, it's not hard to see how things could turn deadly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, we don't have hard proof that some fishing-related conflict was behind the investor murders.
Right.
But it's definitely a factor investigators would consider.
Of course, got to look at the whole picture. The context, the environment, the potential pressures that might have contributed. It's like laying the groundwork.
Precisely. And this groundwork, it helps us understand the limitations of the investigation back then, 1982. Trying to collect evidence on a burning boat, a remote location, limited technology.
Oh, yeah. I hadn't even thought about that. Even just securing the crime scene, gathering evidence, all of that must have been incredibly challenging.
A logistical nightmare. And then you add in that suspect description. So generic. Could have been anyone, especially in Alaska,
Yeah.
Rugged individualism. It was and still is a way of life up there.
So even with a suspect like John Peel, who had ties to the victims, the lack of that clear evidence, the challenges of the investigation, it makes getting a conviction really difficult.
Incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
And remember, Peel was acquitted twice. That means the jury decided there wasn't enough evidence to prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt.
It really underscores the whole innocent until proven guilty, right? And that high bar for proof in criminal trials.
Absolutely. This case really highlights that. The system, it tries to get it right, but it's not perfect. There are intricacies, nuances that can lead to, well, outcomes that might not make sense to the average person.
Right, right. And in a case like this, so emotionally charged, everyone wants answers. But it's important to remember the legal process is designed to be deliberate. It's not meant to be rushed.
You got it.
Okay, so we've got a case with no clear motive, a suspect who is clear, and so many unanswered questions. I keep thinking about the victims' families. How did they deal with this loss with no real closure?
The sources really highlight the impact on the families, the whole Craig community. There's this one quote from Dave Freeman. He grew up with two of the victims, Dean Moon and Jerome King. He said, "You never stop thinking about them. The shock of losing everyone, it really tore up our town."
It's like a wound that never truly heals. And in a small town where everyone knows each other, that loss is felt by everyone.
Exactly. And Brian Kuhn, Jerome's brother, he talks about how it still haunts him. It never goes away, he said. It's always there. Imagine carrying that grief for, over 40 years, not knowing for sure who did it or why.
It reminds you that justice isn't just about the courts. It's about truth, accountability, resolution for the victims and their loved ones. And when those things are missing, it's so much harder to heal.
You're right. And this case remaining unsolved, the idea that whoever did this might still be out there.
It's just another layer of anxiety for everyone.
Exactly.
I remember earlier you mentioned the People magazine Investigates episode. Do you think, with them revisiting the case after all this time, that there's a chance maybe of uncovering something new? Leads, information?
It's definitely possible. Sometimes time helps. Witnesses remember things, or forensic technology advances, and you can re-examine evidence.
It's a long shot, but a glimmer of hope that maybe there's still a chance for justice. Do the sources mention anything about the investigators possibly overlooking something that could be looked at again with fresh eyes, new tech?
Well, they don't get into specifics about missed evidence,
Yeah.
but they do point out the limitations of forensic science back then. Imagine if DNA testing had been as advanced in '82 as it is now. Even a tiny bit of blood or saliva could potentially ID the killer.
Wow. So the case might be closed, but technology could still break it open. It makes you wonder, how many other cold cases are out there, just waiting for the right tech to come along?
Great point. Cold cases, they often hinge on that one missing piece. And technology keeps evolving. So the odds of finding that piece, they keep getting better.
But even with all the technology, we can't forget that this is about people, understanding human behavior, motives, the criminal mind.
Absolutely. That's where forensic psychology comes in. By understanding the psychology of the killer, maybe we can get a glimpse into their motivations, their planning, their choices.
That's fascinating. So if we used modern forensic psychology on the investor case, what kind of profile would we get? Would the way the crimes were committed, the planning, the cover-up, tell us something about the killer?
That's the question, isn't it? And it's one we need to explore. So let's dive into the psychology of the killer with the tools of modern forensic science and see what we can uncover.
Okay, so we've talked about the fishing world back then, the challenges the investigators faced, and the impact this all had on the families. Now, let's try and get inside the killer's head a little. What can we learn from how these crimes were committed?
All right, so first things first, profiling, especially with cold cases. It's not an exact science.
Right.
We can't say for sure this is exactly what the killer was like, but we can use the evidence, the behavioral patterns, to create a possible profile, sort of like a starting point.
So, with the investor, what stands out to you?
Well, the way the murders were carried out, so methodical. This wasn't a crime of passion, no heat of the moment thing. This was planned. Every step calculated. Chilling, really.
Yeah.
Think about it. Moving the boat, getting rid of evidence, even steering the investor after everyone was dead.
It's almost like they had a script and they were just following it.
Exactly. And that level of control, the premeditation,
Mm-hmm.
it's a lot to unpack.
Doesn't that suggest someone who knew their way around boats, someone comfortable out on the water?
It's definitely a strong possibility. Someone familiar with the area, with boating, maybe even with fishing practices specifically, they would have had an advantage, both in carrying out the murders and, trying to disappear afterwards.
So someone who could blend in, not raise any red flags. What about the weapon? A .22 caliber. What does that tell us?
The .22, it's interesting. It's a smaller caliber, generally associated with quieter firearms, less powerful.
Right.
So maybe the killer wanted to keep things quiet, avoid detection, or maybe they weren't comfortable with a more powerful gun. Hard to say for sure.
So many possibilities, and it feels like each detail, each choice the killer made could be a clue. Do you think they knew the victims, or was this random?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Tough to say without knowing the motive. But the way the killer tried to cover their tracks, moving the boat, the evidence, it does seem like they had something to lose.
Right.
Maybe someone who was connected to the victim somehow. Someone who'd be in trouble if they were caught.
It's like we've got this puzzle, almost all the pieces, but we're missing that one crucial one, the one that completes the picture. Makes you wonder if the investigators missed something back then. Some clue, some piece of evidence.
Well, technology has come a long way since 1982. Think about DNA analysis. Back then, it was basically brand new. Today, we can get DNA from the tiniest samples.
So you're saying there's a chance, maybe, that re-examining the evidence with today's technology.
Could turn up something new. Absolutely. It's a possibility, at least.
Wow, a second chance at justice.
Maybe. But even if no new forensic evidence comes up, revisiting the case, looking at it with fresh eyes, using modern profiling techniques, behavioral analysis, all of that could give us new insights.
So even after all these years, there's still hope. Hope that we might learn the truth.
There's always hope. And even if the killer is never found, understanding their motives, their actions, that can help us learn from this tragedy, maybe even prevent something like this from happening again.
You know, as we wrap up this deep dive, I keep coming back to that quote from John Peel, the suspect who was acquitted. He called it a tragedy that just got compounded and compounded, and it's so true.
It really speaks to how these events ripple outward. The victims and their families, the whole town of Craig, even Peel himself, having to live with this suspicion, even though he was cleared. It's a lot to bear.
It reminds us that justice isn't just about punishment. It's about finding the truth, about understanding, about healing. And in a case like this, where those things are still missing, it's hard. So hard to move on.
It is. But there's always hope. Hope for answers, hope for healing, hope for a future where this kind of senseless violence doesn't happen.
For our listener who wanted to delve into the mystery of the investor, we hope this deep dive has given you some insights, maybe even sparked some new questions of your own. It's a case that sticks with you, a story of loss, resilience, and the ongoing search for truth and justice. Thanks for joining us.